The first thing I remember is the sharp crack that split the room open like a fault line running through the earth. It was not just a slap. It was a sound that carried weight and heat and humiliation echoing against the marble walls of the Rosecliff Ballroom in Newport. For a moment, I wondered if the chandeliers had trembled. My cheek burned before my brain even understood what had happened. My head snapped to the side, and the scent of spilled champagne rose with an odd sweetness that made my stomach twist. The music died instantly. The string quartet froze mid-measure. Conversations dissolved as if the entire room had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe. 300 guests stood in silence beneath gilt arches and towering floral displays. Every single one of them had seen it. Franklin Hale stood in front of me with his hand still half raised and his eyes narrowed in that familiar way that suggested he enjoyed the moment more than he should have. His navy suit gleamed under the soft golden lights. His tie was perfectly knotted. His posture was straight and proud and full of the kind of arrogance that comes easily to men who have never been told no. "Useless as always," he said in a voice that carried far more than he intended. "You do not belong in this family." There was no anger in his tone, only disdain, cold, instinctive disdain that had been sharpened over the 27 years he had been in my life. Around us the guests whispered behind gloved hands. "Is she a cousin?" someone murmured. "No, I think she is the step one," someone else said. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I refused to look away from him. The humiliation pressed against my ribs like a physical weight. My heart thudded painfully loud in my ears. The back of my throat tasted of metal. Just moments earlier, I had bent down to help a server who had dropped a folded linen napkin. A simple, kind gesture. Nothing more. But the hem of my dress caught on the raised edge of the thick ivory carpet. My shoulder brushed Elise Hale, who was standing nearby, admiring the guests as if they were her personal audience. The tray in her hand tipped, and the delicate coupe glass she held lost balance. It tilted just enough for the champagne to spill across the front of her beaded gown. $25,000 worth of hand-sewn crystals now glistened with golden liquid. The room gasped, but Elise gasped louder. The young bride clutched the bodice of her gown like someone had stabbed her. Her perfect curls bounced as she whipped around to glower at me. "Why is she even here?" she hissed to her bridesmaid. Her voice was sharp and bright and dripping with contempt. The words landed like pebbles on bruised skin. Elise had always been careful when she insulted me before the wedding. Subtle jabs tucked behind smiles. Low comments disguised as jokes. Now she made no effort to hide it. Franklin saw her distress, and his expression shifted from irritation to performative outrage. He stepped toward me with long, forceful strides. Then, without warning, without hesitation, he struck me. The sting bloomed across my cheek like fire spreading across dry grass. I tasted blood, though I could not tell if I had bitten my lip or if the humiliation itself had metallic flavor. My knees buckled, but I forced myself to stand upright. Every instinct told me to shrink, but something deep inside refused. Elise looked at me as if I had crawled out from under a table. Her mouth curled into a small, satisfied smirk that made the corners of her eyes tighten. "Grace ruins everything," she said. A few guests nodded as if it explained the whole night. The server I had helped earlier stared at me with horror in his eyes. His hands trembled around his tray. I wished he would look away. Anything was better than the pity I saw in his expression. I felt small, but I refused to be invisible. A pulse of anger flared under the shame. It was faint, but it was real. I swallowed hard and lifted my chin. The room was so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the overhead chandelier. I could hear the ocean outside, crashing softly against the cliffs below the terrace. I could even hear my own breathing stutter. Franklin adjusted his cufflink like the matter was settled, like he had taught a child a lesson, like he believed I would nod my head and apologize for ruining their perfect day. I forced myself to stay still, though my entire body trembled. I felt every set of eyes boring into me, judging, misunderstanding, assuming. This family always made assumptions about me, that I had nothing, that I was nothing, that I should be grateful to stand at the edges of their glittering world. My cheek throbbed, but I kept my posture straight. My hands curled lightly at my sides. My throat felt tight, but my voice stayed inside where it was safe. Not one of them knew the truth. Not one of them knew what their perfect wedding had cost me. Not one of them knew that I had built that night with money I would never see again. Not one of them knew that the entire $280,000 venue and the designer floral arches and the five-course dinner and the orchestra and the ridiculous ice sculpture were all made possible by me. They did not know about the wire transfer or the savings I had emptied or the small inheritance from my father that I had placed quietly into the hands of a planner who never even asked my name. They did not know because I never told them. But one day they would, because the truth has a way of rising even when everyone tries to bury it. That wedding existed because of me, and the $1 million they never thanked me for. The day my stepfather's hand met my face was not the day my life shattered. It was simply the day all the cracks finally aligned. People believe breaking happens in an instant like glass dropped on marble, but I have learned it is slower than that. It is a quiet erosion, a wearing down of worth grain by grain, until the final moment arrives and everything collapses in a single breath. As I stood there in that glittering ballroom with my cheek burning and 300 eyes judging me, I felt something inside me shift. Not break, not snap, just shift like a door that had been stuck for years finally giving way. People do not break in one day. They break piece by piece. And I had been breaking for decades. What surprised me in that moment was not the pain, but the silence. A silence so deep and sharp that it carved a space around me, separating me from the world I had tried so hard to belong to. The room blurred as I stared back at Franklin Hale, the man who married my mother when I was 18 and spent the next 27 years reminding me that I was not his. He had never struck me before, but he had used 1,000 quieter blows. Words meant to belittle. Gestures meant to exclude. Expectations designed to make me fail. Maybe that was why the physical slap felt almost familiar. It was simply the loudest version of everything he had been saying to me for years. You do not belong. You never have. You never will. As I pressed my lips together to keep them from trembling, I wondered how long I had been waiting for this moment without realizing it. How long I had been holding myself together for the sake of my mother, for the sake of Elliot, for the sake of keeping peace in a family that never wanted me as part of it. And for what? So I could stand here in a gown I bought myself at a wedding I paid for and be treated as if I had snuck in through the service entrance. The truth stung more than the slap. It was not the humiliation that changed everything. It was the clarity. I had spent years navigating this family like walking on a tightrope stretched above 100 unspoken rules. Do not speak too loudly. Do not take up space. Do not expect gratitude. Do not dare to ask for respect. But as the whispers circled around me like smoke, I felt something rise inside me. A quiet, steady voice I had not heard in a long time. Enough. Not shouted, not violent, just firm. Enough. My cheek pulsed with heat, but beneath the sting was something else. Awareness. Recognition. A slow awakening that maybe everything I had tolerated had led me here to this moment, where the final blow made it impossible to continue pretending. I looked at Elise, the new bride, the woman who would have been my sister-in-law, and saw not anger but satisfaction in her eyes, as if the slap had restored an order she believed I had upset. In that instant, I realized I could never return to the role they wanted me to play, the dutiful outsider, the polite afterthought, the invisible benefactor. Something had ended, but something else had begun. Under the shimmering lights and the frozen stares, I understood that my life would never go back to what it was before this moment. I did not know yet what would unfold in the coming hours, but I knew this was the day everything changed. Not because I was struck, but because for the first time in my life, I finally felt the full truth of who I was and who I no longer owed anything to. I was not born into the Hale family. I entered it the way many children do after tragedy, carried in the arms of a mother desperate for stability and remarriage after losing everything she loved. My childhood ended the year my father died in a construction accident on a freezing February morning. One moment he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, and the next my mother was collapsing to the kitchen floor as two men in orange safety jackets removed their hats and told her they were sorry. I was 16, old enough to understand, but still young enough to believe grief could be temporary if you tried hard enough. My mother, Martha, was a warm woman, gentle even, but she had never been good with loneliness. After my father passed, she wilted like something inside her had been snuffed out. Bills piled up. The house grew cold. Meals shrank. And in that state of exhaustion and fear, she met Franklin Hale at a civic charity event where she had taken a temporary job cleaning up after guests. He noticed her sadness before he noticed her. He told her she deserved better and promised he would give her a new life. She believed him. I suppose I did too, if only because I wanted so badly to see my mother smile again. Franklin married her quickly. I remember the ceremony, a small courthouse affair. He wore a tailored suit and carried himself with the stiff posture of a man who believed he had earned the right to judge a room by simply entering it. In the beginning, he was overly polite to me, but even at 16, I recognized the kind of politeness that came from obligation rather than affection. He would call me kiddo with a tone that always seemed to place me 3 steps behind his own son Elliot, who was 10 years old then. Elliot had his father's blonde hair and naturally confident air, the kind of child who never had to fight for attention because he was the center of it by default. The first time I entered their home, I knew immediately where I ranked. The Hale house in Providence was large, too large for 3 people, filled with white walls and expensive furniture no one was allowed to touch. My bedroom was down the hall from the laundry room, smaller than the linen closet, furnished with a single bed and a dresser that had chips in the paint as if it had been rescued from storage. Elliot's room was twice the size of mine, with a loft bed, a gaming console, and murals painted by a local artist. When I asked if I could move to a room with a window, Franklin told me, "You should be grateful you have a room at all." That was the first shadow that settled over my childhood with him. It was not the last. Within a month, the small courtesies disappeared. He corrected the way I spoke, the way I sat, the way I chewed my food, as if every gesture I made offended his sense of order. If I laughed too loudly, he said it was unbecoming. If I spoke too softly, he accused me of mumbling. He commented on my hair, saying it was too plain on my clothes, saying they looked inexpensive on my posture, saying it made me look insecure. Once, when I was sick with the flu, feverish and shaking, he told my mother I was exaggerating to avoid school. He insisted I come downstairs for dinner anyway. I remember sitting at the table barely able to swallow while he lectured me about responsibility. When I excused myself to throw up, he said, "She is doing this for attention." And though my mother wanted to defend me, I saw fear in her eyes. Fear of losing the stability he provided. Fear of losing the house. Fear of losing everything again. She always folded under that fear. By the time I was 17, I learned to disappear emotionally before others forced me to disappear physically. At family gatherings, he asked me to sit at the folding table in the corner while he and Elliot sat at the main dining table. At holidays, he made subtle remarks about how I did not resemble anyone, reminding everyone I was not a Hale by blood. During a 4th of July barbecue, one of his friends asked if I was his daughter. I will never forget the tight smile on his face when he said no, she came with the package deal. I carried plates and refilled drinks that day, pretending I did not hear the laughter. He treated me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and Elliot took cues from him. Where my father had once encouraged me in school, Franklin ignored my grades completely, but praised Elliot for every minor accomplishment. If Elliot got a B, he celebrated. If I got an A, he accused me of bragging. When I applied for college, he told me not to expect financial help. "Your father should have planned better," he said. He never said father with respect. It always sounded like inconvenience. So I worked 3 summer jobs, saved everything I could, and attended a community college, while Elliot prepared for private school with tutors Franklin paid handsomely for. I learned early that needing nothing from Franklin was the only way to survive him. What hurt more than his cruelty was the quiet acceptance of it. My mother avoided conflict and believed that keeping the peace was the only way to keep a family intact. She often asked me to let things go to avoid upsetting him. She would say, "He is not bad, Grace. He is just proud." But pride does not make a man belittle a child or place worth on a pedigree. Pride is not what makes a man sigh dramatically whenever you enter a room or tell the family to speak clearly because you might not understand. Pride does not make a man tell a 16-year-old girl that she would not amount to much because she came from a man who left her nothing but debt. Those were not moments of pride. They were moments of cruelty disguised as structure wrapped in a veneer of sophistication he used to impress his wealthy circle. Every small humiliation was a drop of water carving a deeper groove inside me, and by the time I left for college, I had grooves instead of confidence. But pain is also a seed. It grows into resolve if you let it. And though I did not know it then, every cruel word Franklin Hale spoke to me planted the resolve I would draw on decades later in a ballroom full of strangers. The shadows of my childhood did not disappear. They stretched forward, following me into adulthood, influencing every choice I made and every sacrifice I would later give that family. They shaped the person who stood on that marble floor with a burning cheek and a quiet storm building behind her eyes. That slap was not the beginning. It was only the echo of every moment that had come before. I left the Hale house the day I turned 18 with a single duffel bag, $200, and a quiet vow that I would never again let anyone in that family decide my value. I remember standing at the bus station with the morning sun cutting through the mist and feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. I had no safety net, no college fund, no father's savings, no trust fund like Elliot, but I had something they never expected me to have: determination. That first year on my own was built from long hours and aching joints. I worked at a small accounting firm that barely paid above minimum wage, and in the evenings I stocked shelves at a local grocery store. My feet burned by the end of every shift, and I often came home too tired to cook, eating leftover sandwiches from the store that would have been thrown out. I learned to stretch $20 across a week. I learned to live without heat some months. I learned to survive without complaint. My hands changed quickly that year. They lost the soft look of adolescence and became the hands of a working woman. Calloused fingertips from carrying boxes, dry knuckles from cheap soap, in the store restroom, faint ink stains that never washed out completely from balancing ledgers. There is a kind of pride in having hands that can do hard things. I did not know that then, but I would later. I pushed myself through community college, one slow semester at a time, taking night classes after work. While others my age went to parties, I sat under flickering fluorescent lights learning tax code and bookkeeping. I graduated with no celebration, no family cheering, no photo in a cap and gown. I signed my diploma alone at the kitchen counter of my tiny apartment, but that moment belonged entirely to me, untouched by the Hale name. Meanwhile, Elliot lived a life designed by privilege. Franklin hired private tutors, paid for summer programs, bought him a car at 16, and boasted to anyone who would listen that his son would go Ivy League. I watched from the outside through holiday gatherings I occasionally attended. Elliot always greeted me politely, almost warmly, but never questioned the imbalance. Why would he? Children raised in comfort rarely notice those who hold the weight beneath them. Franklin continued to send subtle reminders that I was not part of their world. During a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 20, he told a story about Elliot's academic accomplishments, then casually added, "Grace is doing something with numbers, I think. Something small." My mother laughed politely, missing the sting entirely. I learned to swallow those insults, storing them somewhere deep where they would not poison me. I kept my distance, but I never cut them off. I still loved my mother, and she lived in that house, so I endured the occasional dinner, the occasional holiday, the occasional comment designed to remind me I was temporary. By 25, I had worked my way into a better accounting position at a mid-size logistics company. The salary was modest but steady. I no longer needed a second job, though I still lived frugally out of habit. I started putting money into a retirement account, then into a high-yield savings account. Every dollar felt like proof that I could live independently of the man who had once told me I would never succeed without his help. There were nights when exhaustion pressed against my temples like a clamp. 12-hour days at the office during tax season, followed by evenings crunching numbers for small businesses who paid me under the table just to get their books in order. I built my life one ledger, one invoice, one paycheck at a time. I never asked anyone for anything. While Elliot partied through college and studied abroad in London, I saved enough to buy a used car that rattled when it hit 40 miles per hour. While his vacations were paid for, I skipped meals some weeks so I could cover rent. But I told no one. Not my mother, not coworkers, not the Hale family who assumed I lived quietly and comfortably somewhere in the background of their lives, invisible but stable. I did not want them to know anything about me because I knew what they would do with that information. Franklin used personal details as weapons. By my early 30s, I had paid off my student loans. I had built a small emergency fund. I moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment painted in soft grays with windows that overlooked a quiet street lined with maple trees. It was not luxury, but it was freedom. Every chair, every pan, every book on the shelf I had purchased myself. There is a kind of peace only self-made people understand, a peace that comes from knowing nothing in your life was handed to you. My mother visited occasionally, always alone. She admired my apartment but never stayed long. She said it made her feel guilty knowing how hard I worked while Elliot enjoyed every comfort. I never said the words aloud, but sometimes resentment curled like a small hot coil in my chest. Not toward her, but toward the man she had married. I had accepted that Franklin would never respect me. What I could not accept was how easily he expected me to sacrifice so Elliot could thrive. And I did sacrifice. More than anyone ever realized. By the time I turned 40, I had saved nearly $1 million. A staggering amount for someone with my beginning, but entirely possible through 2 decades of disciplined budgeting investment in my retirement plan and a modest inheritance from my father's life insurance that I never touched until much later. I did not save that money for the Hale family. I saved it to build a future that belonged only to me. But fate has an ironic way of circling back. That money, the result of every hour I had spent working when my body begged for sleep, would one day become the currency of a choice that changed everything. That money would be the reason I stood in that ballroom years later, the reason I was even present at Elliot's wedding, and the reason every guest looked at me with confusion after the slap. They knew nothing about who had paid for the life they celebrated. They only knew the story the Hales told them, and none of those stories ever included me. The request did not arrive with gratitude or humility. It arrived the way everything from the Hale household had always arrived in my life, as an expectation dressed up as a favor. I still remember the evening my phone rang, the screen lighting up with my mother's name. I had just returned from work, dropped my bag by the door, and kicked off my shoes when her trembling voice filled the line. "Grace, honey, do you have a minute?" She asked it gently, but her tone carried that familiar strain. The one she used whenever she tried to shield me from something painful. I sat down on my couch and braced myself. "What happened, Mom?" There was a long silence and then a shaky breath. "It is about Elliot's wedding," she said. I closed my eyes. Of course it was. For 2 months, the Hale household had been consumed with preparations. Newport venues, designer gowns, imported flowers. Elise's vision for the wedding was something out of a magazine meant for billionaires, not ordinary families. It was excessive, but I knew better than to voice judgment. I had been trained my whole life to keep quiet, to support from a distance, to let them build their carefully curated image. I did not know then that that image was already cracking. "Your stepfather is under a lot of pressure," she continued. "The business has been struggling. He has lost 2 major contracts. They put down deposits on the venue and the planner and the caterer, but there is still so much left to pay." I could practically hear her twisting a napkin between her fingers. "Elise wants everything perfect, and Franklin wants to make sure people do not talk. He begged me not to ask you, but honey, I do not know what else to do." Those were the words that did it. Not the request, not the panic, but the truth behind them. Franklin did not want her to ask me because he never wanted to be in a position of needing me. But they did, and suddenly every drop of contempt he had poured on me throughout 2 decades felt like it had been preparing him for this exquisite humiliation. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice steadier than hers. She hesitated. I could tell she hated saying it. 800,000, she whispered, then quickly added, "It is just so they can finalize the contracts. They have already paid something, but it is not enough." I felt air slip out of my lungs. $800,000 is an absurd amount to ask from anyone, let alone a daughter who had clawed her way up from nothing. But she was not finished. The planner says the full remaining balance will be close to $1 million, she added in a smaller voice. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter because my knees trembled. $1 million. That number echoed through my head like a bell. I had spent 20 years saving it. 20 years denying myself vacations, eating budget meals, taking overtime shifts, putting every extra dollar into accounts labeled savings do not touch and future do not touch. $1 million was not simply money. It was my independence, my resilience, my proof that I had built a life no one could take from me. And now my mother was asking for it not for herself, but for a wedding. A wedding for the son of the man who treated me like a stain on the family name. A wedding for the girl who rolled her eyes every time I walked into a room. A wedding designed to impress people who did not even know I existed. I felt my throat tighten. I love you, Mom, but that is everything I have. I know, she said, voice cracking, and I would never ask if it were not for your brother. He is so excited, Grace. He wants his day to be special. You know how much Franklin cares about appearances. They will not survive the embarrassment if the wedding falls apart. My brother. The golden child. The boy who grew into the man who never once asked why I sat alone at holidays or why my gifts were opened last. But he was still my mother's son, and he had never been cruel to me. Careless, yes. Blind, yes. But not cruel. I knew she was right about one thing. The Hales could not handle humiliation. Their image was their religion, and a failed wedding would tarnish them in ways Franklin would never recover from. I pressed my palm against my forehead. Let me think, I said softly. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the documents that represented my life's work. 3 accounts, 1 retirement fund, and a folder containing the inheritance my father had left me through a small life insurance policy. I had not touched it in 20 years. Whenever I opened it, I imagined his hands signing those papers before he died, hoping to protect his family. I wondered what he would think if he knew I was considering using it to rescue the man who had disrespected his memory for decades. But when I pictured my mother's face, tired, anxious, pleading, I felt the resolve settle in. I had learned endurance from her. She had learned survival from me. Maybe this was the last thing I would ever give that family. Maybe giving it would finally prove I had nothing left to lose. So I called her early the next morning. I will give you the money, I said. She gasped as if she had been holding her breath all night. Oh, my darling, you are saving this family, she cried. She meant it literally and figuratively. They needed me. Not publicly, of course, not in a way anyone would ever acknowledge. But they needed me. In that moment, I realized how deeply I had been conditioned to fill in their gaps quietly. No applause, no recognition, just expectation. One condition I said. Her voice steadied. Anything. You cannot tell Franklin. You cannot tell Elliot. You cannot tell Elise. No one can know this money came from me. My mother hesitated. Why, honey? Because I do not want them to owe me, I said. And because I want peace at this wedding. They will not treat me kindly if they know I funded it. That part was true, but not complete. What I did not say was this. If they knew I had the power to save them, they would resent me for it. And if they knew they depended on me, their contempt would only turn sharper. Better to remain invisible. Safer, even. 2 weeks later, I wired $1 million directly to the planning company. I watched the numbers vanish from my account with a single click. 20 years of labor gone in an instant. I told myself it did not matter. That money could be rebuilt. But respect once lost took far longer to recover. I did not know then how fully the payment would change everything, how deeply it would unsettle the Hale family once the truth came out, or how violently Franklin would react when I stepped into the wedding he believed belonged entirely to him. The weeks leading up to the wedding unfolded with the uneasy precision of a machine that looked polished on the outside but screeched internally with every turn. Nothing about those days felt joyful. Not for me, not for the staff. Not even for Elise, though she hid it under the glossy veneer of bridal perfection. I drove to Newport the Monday before the ceremony because Elise insisted on a full week of pre-wedding events. She had scheduled fittings brunches, seaside photography sessions, and a rehearsal dinner that looked like it belonged to a European royal family. I arrived at the Hale family's rented mansion, a 45-minute drive from the venue. The air smelled of ocean salt, and fresh-cut hydrangeas lined the walkway in expensive ceramic pots. Everything screamed extravagance. Everything screamed money. Money I had provided, a fact no one here knew. Elise greeted me at the door with a smile so bright and brittle it looked ready to splinter. "Grace, good you made it," she said, as if my presence were an inconvenience she needed to check off a list. She looked me up and down with that subtle flicker in her eyes that always made me feel like she was calculating my worth in real time. I had chosen a simple navy dress and sensible flats because this was a week of errands, not celebration. Elise's smile tightened in a way that suggested she expected more sparkle from me. She was used to people dressing to impress her. I never had. Franklin appeared moments later, adjusting the cufflinks I had given my mother years ago. He nodded at me but said nothing. His gaze moved past me quickly, as if making sure no one important was behind me. A familiar gesture. If I had walked through that door carrying gold, he would still have looked past it to see who mattered more. Inside the mansion, staff hurried everywhere, balancing trays, organizing floral samples, and taping charts to the walls. The wedding planner, a tense woman named Meredith, moved like a general preparing for battle. When she saw me, she smiled politely but with a hint of confusion. "And you are," Elise answered for me. "She is family," she said quickly. "Sort of. Not a helpful clarification. Not for Meredith, and not for the three assistants who exchanged glances." I swallowed the sting and followed them into the lounge where dresses hung from garment racks and makeup artists unpacked cases worth more than my monthly rent. The first humiliation came during the final dress fitting. Elise emerged from the fitting room in a gown so intricate it looked sculpted from pearls and frost. Everyone gasped. I did too, because she was undeniably stunning. As she turned, she pointed toward me without looking directly at me. "Someone help Grace fix her dress," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. I turned red. I had spent an hour choosing something tasteful and appropriate. But to her, it was not elegant enough, not rich enough, not Hale enough. One of the assistants approached hesitantly and tugged at the hem, though nothing needed fixing. I murmured a thank you and stepped back. Later, as we practiced walking down the mock aisle, Elise made a theatrical show of correcting my pace. "Slower, Grace. You are rushing." Then 2 minutes later, she snapped, "Faster, Grace. You are dragging." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from reacting. It was easier to endure the small slights than acknowledge why they hurt, because they reminded me of Franklin. His voice lived inside her tone. That same condescension. That same belief that her status granted her the right to shape others as she pleased. At the rehearsal dinner, Franklin gave a toast praising Elliot and Elise for their elegance, their ambition, their bright future. He raised his glass to the Hale legacy and their continued prosperity. Not once did he acknowledge my mother sitting quietly beside him or me, seated near the end of the table. When the desserts were served, he waved at a server and motioned toward my plate. "She does not eat sweets," he said dismissively. I blinked. I loved dessert. He knew that. But in that moment, it was not about truth. It was about power. Controlling even the smallest of details reinforced his belief that I belonged beneath his decisions. Elliot was kinder, though absorbed in his world. He hugged me each time he saw me. He asked about my work and said he appreciated me for coming, but appreciation is different from awareness. He did not see the way Elise's friends whispered about my dress at the welcome brunch. He did not hear Franklin telling one of his colleagues that I was a distant relative who had generously volunteered to help with errands. Volunteer. As if my presence here was charity for them rather than an act of support that had cost me everything I had saved over 2 decades. On Wednesday, the florist arrived with mock-ups. The arrangements were enormous cascading displays of white orchids, lilies, and hydrangeas. Meredith asked Franklin whether they should increase the height of the centerpieces for the reception. Franklin rubbed his chin and said, "Yes." Elise chimed in, saying, "It will make the room feel more expensive." I stood behind them watching as they discussed adjustments that would easily cost another $20,000. A sum paid from money they believed came from nowhere. During the seating review, Elise pointed at the chart and said, "Grace can sit near the side. It is a better angle for photos." What she meant was away from the family portraits, away from the head table, away from visibility. I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest, the same heaviness I had felt as a teenager sitting at the folding table during holidays. Invisible, necessary only in ways that served them. Not once, not even for a moment during that week did any of them ask me how I was, whether I needed rest, whether I was comfortable, whether I wanted to be part of the celebration. My mother looked at me with guilt in her eyes but stayed silent. She always stayed silent. Silence had become her survival strategy in that house. On Friday night, while the mansion buzzed with final preparations, I stepped onto the back terrace to breathe. The ocean wind whipped at my hair. In the distance, the moonlight shimmered across the water, creating a perfect line between where I stood and the dark horizon. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake agreeing to any of this. I wondered if giving them the money had not been an act of love, but an act of surrender, a final attempt to belong where I never truly had. I placed my hands on the stone railing, feeling the rough, cold surface beneath my palms. My hands, the same hands that had carried my life through 20 years of labor, the same hands that had allowed this wedding to exist. And yet, in this place, in this family, those hands were unworthy. Elise's voice carried through the open doors. "Everything has to be perfect," she said. "No mistakes, no stress, no distractions." Her words were meant for the planner, but they landed on me like a warning. And deep down, beneath the exhaustion and forced politeness, something inside me whispered that perfection built on cruelty never holds. That one wrong step can unravel everything. And I had already taken that step. I just did not know it yet. The morning of the wedding arrived, wrapped in the kind of soft coastal fog that made the world look suspended between dream and waking. Newport had always carried that illusion, a blend of quiet wealth and misted shorelines, but on that particular morning, the fog felt heavier, as if it already sensed the weight of everything that was about to unfold. The Hale family moved through the mansion like actors preparing for a show. Makeup artists, photographers, planners, and stylists flowed from room to room with the urgency of people who had been told perfection was the only acceptable outcome. Elise floated among them like a queen draped in silk and expectation. She wore a white robe with her new initials embroidered in gold thread, her laugh sharp, bright, and rehearsed. Every detail had been choreographed, every movement planned. Every face around her existed to ensure she appeared flawless. I was not one of those faces. That much was clear the moment I walked into the bridal suite with a small box containing the earrings my mother asked me to bring. Elise barely glanced at me. She flicked her fingers toward a makeup artist and said, "Fix the shine on my cheek," as though she had not just spoken over me. I set the box on the vanity without a word. Her bridesmaids whispered behind their glasses of champagne, their eyes flicking to me and away, just as quickly. It was the same rhythm I had known since childhood, a familiar choreography of exclusion. By noon, we were transported to Rosecliff in sleek black cars. The mansion loomed with the same imposing elegance it always held. Marble columns gleaming. Hundreds of chairs lined the garden, flowers climbing the archway, photographers pacing in anticipation. Every inch of the estate looked like it had been built for royalty. And in many ways it had, though this particular kingdom had been funded by someone invisible. The ceremony itself passed without disaster, a surprise given how nervous the staff looked each time Elise adjusted something or glared at someone. I watched Elliot as he stood at the altar. He looked happy, hopeful, and oblivious. He glanced at me once smiling in that soft, sincere way he had always smiled. He had no idea what was beneath the surface of this day. No idea that the foundation of his perfect wedding was built on a sacrifice he had never acknowledged. After the ceremony, guests drifted to the reception hall where an orchestra played beneath towering ceilings. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne oysters and tiny blinis topped with caviar. The chatter grew louder. The music swelled. Laughter echoed against marble. Everything looked magnificent. Everything looked expensive. I stood near a column taking in the scene, letting the ocean breeze from the terrace cool my nerves. I told myself I could get through the night. I only needed a few hours of endurance, just enough to avoid being a problem, just enough to disappear smoothly into the background like they always preferred. That was when I saw the young server struggling at the entrance of the hall. He was barely 20 thin with a slightly crooked bow tie. His tray was laden with champagne coupes stacked too high for him to balance. His arms shook. His breath shook. From across the room, I could see the panic blooming behind his eyes. He would drop the tray. I knew it. The way mothers know when a child is about to fall, the way women know when someone is about to break. Before thinking, I moved toward him. It was the simplest instinct, the kind of thing I had done 1,000 times when working double shifts in my 20s. When I reached him, I placed my hands gently on the tray's edges. "Here, let me help," I whispered. His shoulders loosened with relief. "Thank you," he mouthed. For a moment, the tray was steady. For a moment, the world felt steady. Then I stepped back, and that was where everything cracked open. My heel, the one pair of dress shoes I allowed myself to splurge on for the wedding, caught the edge of the ornate carpet. A thick, embroidered monstrosity chosen specifically to match Elise's vision for old-world elegance. My ankle twisted, the tray tipped, and time split itself into fragments. 1,000 bright pieces of crystal lifted into the air like a shimmering wave, champagne arced in golden streaks. The sound of coupes shattering against marble echoed like brittle music. The wave crashed directly onto Elise. The entire front of her beaded gown darkened as the champagne soaked through layer after layer. Pearls shimmered with sticky golden liquid. Elise froze. Guests froze. Servers froze. Even the orchestra faltered. The silence that followed was monstrous, slow, echoing, suffocating. Elise drew in a sharp breath, her eyes locked on the stain blooming across her chest. Then she screamed. "Do you even know how to walk properly?" Her voice cracked through the hall like a blade. Heads turned, cameras lifted, gasps fluttered through the crowd like startled birds. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words stuck in my throat. Before I could gather myself, Franklin appeared. He stormed toward me with heavy, determined steps, as if he had been waiting for this moment for decades. I had seen that look on his face before, the look of a man about to scold someone into dust, but this time he did not scold. He struck. The slap came without hesitation, without reason, without restraint. The impact stung down my jaw, across my cheek, and into my ear. The world tilted. The marble floor rushed toward me, and I caught myself clumsily against a table, my hands trembling from shock. Franklin's voice boomed across the room. "You ruin everything! Always! Always!" The word echoed like an accusation directed at my existence. Elise clutched her dress eyes blazing with satisfaction rather than outrage. Her lips curled. "Trash stays trash," she whispered to her maid of honor. A sentence so soft yet so sharp it sliced deeper than the slap. The server I had helped seconds earlier stood frozen with horror, his tray on the ground, his face pale. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, judging, whispering, some confused, some delighted by the drama, some pitying. Pity only deepened the humiliation. My throat tightened as I tried to breathe. The marble was cold beneath my feet, the air thick, the shame hot. This was not just a spill, not just an accident. This was years of resentment erupting in the most public way possible. And all I could do was stand there, cheek-burning, heart-pounding, every humiliation from my past layering themselves over this moment like sediment. They wanted a villain in their story. They wanted a reason to treat me as less. They wanted a spectacle. And I had delivered one without meaning to. I pressed my palm against my cheek, feeling the sting. This wedding was built on my sacrifice, my years, my exhaustion, my life. And yet here I was, treated as if I had wandered in from the street. My chest tightened. Something inside me quivered. Not weakness, not shame. Something else. Something rising. something waiting. But in that moment, all I could hear was the dark silence after a storm, a silence that signaled nothing would ever be the same. The silence after the slap was a living thing pulsing through the room as if the very walls were holding their breath. I could feel it pressing against my skin heavier than the pain blooming across my cheek. For a moment, the world narrowed to three sensations: the sting of impact, the cold marble beneath my heels, and the echoing memory of Franklin's voice telling me I ruined everything. Then another sound cut through the air, a low, deliberate clearing of the throat, amplified across the hall by the microphone at the center of the stage. Every head turned. Elliot stood there, fingers curled around the mic stand, knuckles, pale eyes locked not on his bride, not on the guests, but squarely on me. His expression was unreadable, controlled, still. But the stillness was dangerous, like the ocean just before a rip current drags everything under. Elise stepped toward him, her voice wobbling between outrage and whining theatrics. "Baby, she ruined my dress like she always does something she tried." Her words disintegrated when Elliot raised one hand without looking at her. A single sharp gesture. Silence fell again. He took a breath so slow I could see the conflicted rise of his chest. Then his gaze slid toward Franklin. "Dad, what did you just do?" The simplicity of the question made it heavier. Franklin's posture stiffened. He straightened his jacket. He jabbed a finger in my direction. "She did this," he barked. "She embarrassed your wife. She has always been a problem. She brought this on herself." Elliot's jaw tightened hard enough to pulse beneath his skin. His voice dropped to a level I had never heard from him, calm, cold, and resonant. "Answer the question. What did you just do?" Franklin opened his mouth to speak again, but the room seemed to tilt when Elliot took a single step forward, the sound of his shoe echoing in the vast ballroom. "You slapped her," he said, voice steady like a verdict. "In front of our family, in front of our friends, in front of 300 people. You humiliated her. You put your hands on my sister." The word sister traveled across the room like a tremor. I felt the breath leave my lungs. He had never called me that in public. Not once. Not in 27 years. The shift in the room was immediate. Whispers, gasps, phones lifted higher. Elise tried again, reaching for his arm like she could redirect the scene back into her control. "Elliot, this is not about her. This is about your wedding," she insisted, her lips trembling with frustration. "No," he said firmly. "This is about exactly her." Elise blinked, confused, insulted. Elliot looked at me again, and something in his eyes twisted painfully into my chest. Something sharp, regretful, furious. He turned back to the microphone. "She did not ruin this night." He paused. The next words came in a low, precise tone that seemed to slice through the air. "She built it." The ballroom stilled. Elliot continued, voice gaining force with every syllable. "Every flower, every chandelier, every plate, every string of the orchestra, every inch of this night exists because of the woman you just slapped, and then louder she paid for this wedding." A collective gasp rolled through the hall like a wave hitting stone. Elise's face drained of color. Franklin blinked once slowly, like he was trying to process words spoken in an unfamiliar language. My knees weakened. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. Elliot held the crowd in absolute silence. While all of you assumed she was background, she was footing the bill for this entire event. Almost $1 million. My mother behind Franklin clapped a hand to her mouth. Her eyes glossed with guilt, shame, shock. Franklin shook his head, sputtering, "This is ridiculous. She is lying. She never." Elliot cut him off. "She transferred the funds herself. I saw the statements while reviewing some paperwork for the planner last month. I did not say anything because she asked for privacy, something none of you ever gave her." Elise staggered backward, clutching her ruined gown as if the beating could shield her. "You mean she—" He nodded. "She paid for your dream wedding, Elise. The one you bragged about for a year. The one you said would prove you finally made it. The one you designed to impress people you barely know." Franklin's mouth twisted. He glanced at the guests, at their stunned faces. His voice snapped with angry disbelief. "Why would she pay for our event? Why would she do that?" Elliot stared at him with a look that made my throat tighten, a combination of disgust and disappointment so deep it belonged to decades, not minutes. "Because she is better than you," he said. "She always has been." He set the microphone back on its stand. His shoulders rose as he inhaled slowly, gathering himself. Then he looked at Elise one final time. "I cannot do this," he said quietly but painfully clear. Elise's eyes widened. "What do you mean you cannot?" He swallowed hard. "The wedding. This marriage. This life built on pretense and cruelty. It is over." A few people gasped loudly enough to echo. Elise grabbed his arm nails, digging in. "Elliot, you cannot end this now, not in front of everyone." His voice cracked with exhaustion. "This is the only time to end it because now everyone sees who you are." Elise stared at him as if trying to command the world back into her control, but nothing responded. The illusion had shattered. Franklin stepped forward, ready to interrupt, but Elliot turned with a ferocity I had never seen in him. "Do not come near her," he said, pointing toward me. "You put your hands on Grace once. You will never do it again." Franklin froze mid-stride. The room locked onto the scene like spectators at a public trial. Elliot walked toward me slowly, deliberately, as if stepping out of the expectations of a lifetime. He removed his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The fabric still carried the warmth of his body. "Grace." "I am so sorry," he whispered. Not a performance, not an obligation. A real apology spoken from a man who had just watched years of silent wrongs unravel in minutes. I opened my mouth, but no words came. He squeezed my arm gently, then turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," he said, voice steady. "The reception is over." Conversations erupted, chairs scraped, phones lifted to record. Some guests rushed to comfort Elise, some to question Franklin, some to whisper feverishly about the scandal they had just witnessed. But my world had narrowed to a single moment, a shift, a release. Something inside me that had carried weight for decades finally loosened. Elliot's voice had ended everything. The wedding, the marriage, the lie of family unity, the illusion that I was invisible. That night would not just be remembered for a slap. It would be remembered for the sentence that cracked an entire family open. In the hours after Elliot ended the wedding, the Hale family began to unravel with the slow, brutal inevitability of a building collapsing in controlled demolition. One blast set off the next, and before long, everything that had looked solid for decades broke apart in pieces too large to hide and too sharp to gather safely. The guests scattered from Rosecliff in a mixture of fascination and discomfort, whispering behind their hands as if afraid the scandal might stain them simply by proximity. The orchestra packed up quickly. The caterers avoided eye contact. The planner muttered to her assistants that she had never seen anything like this in 20 years and that she would need to call her insurance company. Meanwhile, Franklin remained rooted to the spot, breathing hard, his face mottled with a rage he did not know how to disguise. He kept glancing between Elliot, Elise, and the stunned guests, searching for some foothold of control he could grab before the whole room fell away from him. But there was none. Not anymore. My mother hovered behind him, trembling, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. Guilt radiated off her in waves. I could feel it even from across the hall. She had always tried to hold the family together by smoothing over Franklin's rough edges, by staying silent, by hoping quietness would keep peace. But peace built on fear had never been peace at all. Elise stood alone near the floral archway. Her gown soaked, her mascara streaked her entire future, with the Hale name dissolving beneath the weight of public humiliation. She kept looking toward the cameras, desperate to control the narrative, but no angle could save her from the truth Elliot had revealed. The guests left, the staff left, but the shame stayed suspended in the air like a fog that refused to clear. Elliot guided me outside to one of the covered pathways overlooking the waterfront. The night wind chilled my sore cheek. He asked if I needed a doctor. I told him no. What I needed was something no doctor could give closure, clarity, or perhaps simply the ending of a story I had been forced into since I was 16. I expected Elliot to disappear with the chaos gathering around him, but he did not. He stayed beside me, kept everyone away, stood between me and Franklin like a shield he had never been before. I saw Franklin watching us from the terrace, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles quivered. Without the crowd, without the status, without control, he looked smaller. Not physically, spiritually. The expensive suit could not hide the emptiness behind his posture. When the last guest vanished into the valet line, he finally approached. Elliot stepped in front of me immediately, shoulders squared. "Dad, do not!" he warned. Franklin raised both hands as if presenting himself as reasonable, though his eyes held nothing but resentment. "She just humiliated us in front of everyone," he began. Elliot snapped. "She did nothing wrong. You hit her. You insulted her. You abused her. You did that. Not her." Franklin's nostrils flared. He spat out words thick with denial. "She's not family and never has been. She had no business being here. She does not matter to us." Elliot's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "She matters to me." Those 4 words cut deeper into Franklin than any screaming match ever could. Something hollowed out behind Franklin's eyes. I realized then that he cared less about the wedding and more about losing control of the people he believed belonged under his thumb. That loss terrified him. He turned to my mother with barely restrained fury. "Martha, say something," he hissed. "Tell your daughter she has ruined everything." My mother's lip trembled. She looked between us helpless and trapped. For the first time in years, she looked at me not with avoidance but with a flash of recognition, as if she finally saw what had always been true. I had never been the problem. The problem had been standing beside her wearing an expensive suit and a mask of superiority. She whispered instead, "Franklin, please stop." He recoiled as if slapped himself. In that moment, I knew something irreversible had shifted between them too. A fracture decades in the making finally visible under the bright Newport lights. Security had to escort Franklin off the property because he refused to leave. He muttered threats, not violent ones, but the kind meant to wound reputations and punish with silence. "You'll regret this, Elliot," he growled. "And you," he pointed at me, "you will get what you deserve." He did not yet know that karma was already unfolding. Anger disguises fear, but it does not halt consequences. That night, Elliot insisted on driving me back to my hotel. I sat in the passenger seat in stunned quiet, my cheek throbbing, my body exhausted in a way that felt decades old. Elliot apologized again and again, and I finally reached over and rested my hand over his. "It is done," I whispered. He shook his head. "No, it is just starting." He was right. By morning, the video clips were everywhere. Multiple camera angles of the slap. Elise's scream, Elliot's speech, and the final sentence that ended the wedding. News outlets plastered the story across their sites. Guests posted bewildered reactions. Strangers online dissected every second, praising Elliot and condemning Franklin. It spread through Rhode Island, then New England, then nationally by late evening. I found my name trending even though no one had any clue who I truly was. They simply called me the woman who funded the wedding. Others labeled me the stepfather slap victim. I hated both names, not because they exposed me, but because they reduced my entire life to a single public moment. But something unexpected happened too. People defended me. Thousands, tens of thousands. They called out the classism in Elise's scream, the entitlement dripping from Franklin's words, the cruelty of humiliating a woman who had just tried to help a server. I had never felt the world on my side before. It was surreal. But the support did nothing to soften the blow for Franklin. Within 48 hours, his business partners began distancing themselves. Clients canceled contracts, citing concerns about his character. His board forced him to step down until the scandal died down. It never did. The story was too salacious, too symbolic, too perfectly aligned with public cravings for justice. The image of a wealthy, controlling patriarch striking his stepdaughter at a $1 million wedding fueled national outrage. Sponsors pulled funding. Community organizations revoked his speaking invitations. His reputation corroded faster than he could salvage it. Elise fared no better. Her social media brand collapsed. Followers demanded accountability. Brands canceled deals. Her family issued a statement expressing disappointment in her behavior to distance themselves. A week later, Elliot officially annulled the marriage before it had ever been consummated. He moved out of the Hale estate and refused to speak to his father. My mother stayed, but her silence was no longer obedient. It was distant, resigned, as though she finally understood the life she had chosen had cost her a daughter who had survived without her support. And I, for the first time in decades, felt something like release. Not triumph, not revenge, just freedom. The kind that arrives after a storm when the sky cracks open and everything feels uncertain but possible. Karma did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with exposure. And Franklin, stripped of the power he wielded so carelessly, began his long, inevitable fall. The months that followed felt like stepping into a different lifetime, as though the woman who had stood in that glittering ballroom with a burning cheek had dissolved into mist and a quieter, older version of me had emerged in her place. After the scandal exploded and the Hale family fractured publicly, I packed my bags and left Rhode Island behind, without fanfare, without bitterness, without even a goodbye to the house where I had spent too much of my youth, shrinking myself to fit into their expectations. I drove north to Maine, to a small coastal town where the houses were weathered by salt air and the gulls cried overhead with a kind of mournful honesty that felt familiar. I rented a cottage near the shoreline, a simple one-story home with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It was nothing luxurious, but it was mine in a way nothing in the Hale world had ever been. Every morning I made coffee and drank it slowly by the window, letting the gray winter light spill across the wooden table. I kept the radio tuned to a soft classical station because silence now felt like something I chose instead of something forced on me. The first week, I stayed indoors, letting my body settle after years of tension I had never acknowledged. My cheek healed quickly, but the deeper bruises, the ones hidden beneath memory and habit, took longer. Some days I woke up with a sudden jolt, convinced I had overslept for a job I no longer worked or a family obligation I no longer owed. Other days, I simply sat on the porch, wrapped in a knitted blanket, listening to the waves crash against the rocky shore. The wind scratched through the pine trees with a gentle insistence, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without the invisible weight of Franklin's judgment pressing on my chest. About 2 weeks after I settled in Elliott, drove up from Providence. He arrived with groceries, a bag of pastries from a bakery he knew I loved, and the kind of tired eyes that only come from witnessing your entire world collapse. He hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that says, I know I should have done more. We cooked together the way we had at smaller family gatherings when he was younger, before Elise, and before the wedding, and before the weight of loyalty had forced him into silence. He chopped vegetables far too slowly. I teased him like I used to. The kitchen filled with the comforting clatter of pans, the sizzle of onions, and the warmth of an evening that felt almost normal. Over dinner, he told me he had officially moved out of the Hale estate into a modest apartment near his work. It was the first time in his life he had lived without the benefits of his father's money. He admitted he felt relief mixed with an almost childlike fear, as though he were learning to stand again after years of leaning on a structure that had turned out to be hollow. He apologized again and again for the wedding, for the years of blindness, for the times he had not noticed the quiet cruelty directed at me. I placed my hand over his and told him truthfully that I did not want his guilt. Guilt had never built anything, but honesty could. Elliot began visiting every weekend. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we sat on the porch with blankets on our laps watching the sea. Sometimes he talked through the unraveling of his relationship with his father, the sense of betrayal, the grief of realizing the man he had admired had been built on sand. Other times, we said nothing at all, letting the shared silence build a bridge between the years we had lost. My mother called occasionally. Her voice sounded older, thinner, as though the truth of her marriage had finally settled on her shoulders. She apologized often, but always carefully afraid to upset the delicate balance she still tried to maintain in her household. I loved her, but I did not shoulder her guilt for her. People choose their silences. She had chosen hers for decades. Now she lived alone in a house filled with echoes she had spent years pretending were not there. I kept our conversations short but kind. I no longer needed to chase something that had always been out of reach. After a month in Maine, I found a small volunteer group run by a church near the harbor. They provided food and supplies to residents after winter storms, especially the elderly and families in low-income areas. I showed up one morning with a thermos of tea and asked where they needed help. An older woman named Ruth looked at my hands and nodded approvingly. "Hands like that no work," she said. She was right, and it felt good to use them again, not in service to someone who belittled me, but in service to people who simply needed warmth and kindness. I chopped vegetables, stirred soups, lifted boxes, shoveled snow from the entryway when storms came in. I found a rhythm in the labor, a steady heartbeat that anchored me. My hands needed to stay busy. They always had. The work grounded me in ways Rhode Island never had. There were no lavish gowns here, no chandeliers, no performances of wealth. Just simple meals, simple gratitude, simple people trying to make it through harsh winters and harder lives. In many of them, I saw echoes of my father, the quiet resilience of working-class souls who knew how to endure without applause. Some afternoons, I walked along the shoreline collecting sea glass. The ocean had a way of stripping sharp edges from broken things, smoothing them into something unexpectedly beautiful. I often wondered if the same could happen to people, if time and distance could soften old wounds, if forgiveness could form naturally without being forced. I did not know the answer, but being here gave me space to ask the question. As winter thawed into early spring, I felt the pieces of my life slowly reassemble themselves not into the shape they once had, but into something stronger and quieter. I no longer woke to dread. I no longer braced myself for criticism. I no longer waited for someone else to dictate my worth. I was alone in that small cottage, but not lonely. I had built a life without a family's approval, and in these quiet months after the chaos, I learned something I had never been allowed to believe. I had always deserved peace. The day Franklin appeared in Maine was colder than any day that winter had offered, though the calendar insisted it was already spring. The sky churned with heavy clouds, and the sea clawed at the rocks with a restless, rhythmic violence that mirrored something uneasy in my chest. I had spent the morning at the community center ladling soup into bowls for people whose pipes had frozen overnight. The heater in the old church kept sputtering, cutting in and out, but no one complained. They simply pulled their coats tighter and cupped their hands around the bowls as if holding small fires between their palms. When I stepped outside during a lull in the line, the wind slapped my face with icy fingers. I tucked my scarf closer to my neck and breathed in the briny air. It grounded me. It always did. I did not expect to see a car I recognized creeping up the slush-laden road. A dark blue sedan, a model Franklin had always favored long before the wedding, long before the scandal, long before his life began to cave in. The sight of it made my stomach tighten with a memory reflex I thought I had lost. For a moment, I stood still, unsure if the cold on my skin came from the weather or the past gripping me by the throat. The car slowed. Stopped. Franklin stepped out. I would not have recognized him if I had not known it was him. His suit hung loosely on him as though it had once belonged to a bigger man. His face was pale with exhaustion, the deep lines around his mouth carved sharper than before. His once meticulously combed hair was disheveled. Even the way he walked was different, slower, heavier, stripped of the smooth confidence that had always defined him. When he looked up and saw me, he froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind gusted between us like an impatient witness. Finally, he began walking toward me, each step careful as though he expected the ground to crumble beneath his feet. "Grace," he said. My name left his mouth flat and fragile, as if he did not know how to shape it anymore without disdain. I stayed still, refusing to offer him the ease of familiarity. I did not owe him that. He stopped a few feet away, breathing hard, clutching the edge of his coat to steady himself. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Smaller than any memory I carried, and yet some old instinct of caution flared in my spine. I crossed my arms, bracing myself. "What are you doing here?" I asked. No pretense, no softness, just the plain question. His eyes flicked to the church behind me. "So this is where you have been, helping these people?" He said it almost to himself. I lifted my chin. "And you came all the way here to observe that?" He flinched. "No. I came because I did not know where else to go." His voice cracked on the last word. It startled me. In all the years I had known him, Franklin Hale had spoken with certainty, with authority, with the unmovable confidence of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Now his words trembled like they had splinters. He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, the church doors behind me thudded open. Ruth, the volunteer coordinator, leaned out. "Grace, we need more bowls." "Oh!" She stopped when she saw him. Her eyes narrowed in a glance that said enough about her instincts. She lowered her voice. "You all right, honey?" I nodded. "I will be inside in a moment." She gave Franklin a look that could have curdled milk and then went back in. He watched her leave with a sad sort of smile. "You have people who look out for you," he murmured. The irony nearly made me laugh. I wrapped my scarf tighter and looked at him fully. "You followed me across state lines to tell me that." He swallowed. "No. No, I came because I owe you something." A long silence stretched between us. The wind whipped snow dust across the ground like tiny knives. He swallowed again, the bob of his throat visible above the scarf he wore too loosely. "My life is falling apart," he said quietly. "The business is gone. The board removed me. The contracts pulled out. The bank froze my accounts. My colleagues refused to speak with me. Investors abandoned me. I do not have anything left." I studied him. He expected sympathy. He hoped for softness. He had always relied on my mother's softness and believed I shared it. I did not. Not anymore. "That is unfortunate," I said evenly. "But that is not my burden." His jaw tightened. He took a breath as if preparing himself for something painful. "Your mother left too," he said. "She moved in with her sister in Massachusetts. She said she needed space, distance, a life not built on walking around my temper." The admission hit me harder than I expected, but I did not show it. My mother sometimes drowned in silence, but even she had limits. I wondered what final moment had broken her after years of submission. Franklin rubbed his forehead. "I lost my family. I lost my name, my reputation, my home." And then, as if forced out against his will, he added, "They were right to leave. I deserved it." Snowflakes clung to his eyelashes. Or maybe they were tears he refused to let fall. I could not tell. He took another step closer. I came because I wanted to apologize. Not to clear my name, not to earn anything. Just to say the words I should have said a long time ago. He paused. The wind howled through the tree branches overhead. "I am sorry, Grace. For everything. For the way I treated you. For every time I made you feel unwanted. For every word meant to remind you that you did not belong. They were cruel. I was cruel. I said nothing." His breath shuddered. "You did nothing wrong, and I spent half my life convinced you were the problem. But it was me. It was always me. I let pride turn me into someone I do not recognize." He looked at his trembling hands. "I watched your life fall apart too, at the wedding. I watched your humiliation. I did that to you. You deserved better. You deserved respect. You deserved a father figure who protected you, not one who diminished you." I needed to hear him say it, but hearing it did not melt the walls I had built. I crossed my arms tighter. Why now? Why after all this time? He let out a brittle laugh, because the one person who should have stood by me walked away, and the only person I should have valued was the one I pushed aside. He took a breath. "I have nothing now. But I needed to tell you that what I did to you was wrong. Every piece of it." I let his words settle in the cold air. Apologies are curious things. They can heal or they can reopen wounds. They can be gifts or they can be burdens. They can be honest or merely convenient. I searched his face for the truth. There was no entitlement left in him, only exhaustion, only ruin, only a man stripped of all his defenses. I stepped back and motioned toward the church door. "Come inside." He blinked at me confused. "Come inside?" I repeated. "It is cold." He hesitated as if expecting a trap or scolding. When none came, he followed me inside, moving slowly like a man entering a sanctuary he feared he had no right to approach. The warmth inside hit us immediately. The smell of soup and bread lingered in the air. People huddled on benches or sat at folding tables with their coats around their shoulders. Franklin stared at them as though he were seeing people like this for the first time, really seeing them. Ruth glanced over, her face pinched. I lifted my hand slightly to tell her it was all right. She nodded reluctantly. I walked behind the counter where the large steel pot simmered and ladled soup into a bowl. My hands moved by instinct, the way they had for months now. When it was full, I grabbed a piece of bread and placed it on the side. I held the bowl out to him. Eat. It is cold out there. It was the same tone I had used to offer comfort to strangers dozens of times, but using it on him felt strangely final, like closing the last page of a story that had taken too long to finish. He stared at the bowl as though it were something sacred. Then slowly, with shaking hands, he accepted it. The warmth of it must have struck him because his eyes softened. He whispered, "Thank you," not like a demand, not like an expectation, like gratitude, raw, sincere, unearned. He walked toward an empty table in the corner, shoulders hunched, the bowl cradled carefully between his palms. I watched him sit, bow his head, take one trembling spoonful, another. His body sagged as if he had not eaten properly in days. Perhaps he had not. Ruth came up beside me, her voice low. "You want me to send him away, honey?" I shook my head. "No, let him be." She eyed me curiously. "You sure?" I nodded. "This is where it ends. Not in revenge, not in bitterness, in truth, in distance, in peace." Watching Franklin sitting alone at a folding table eating soup in a church basement was not satisfying the way I once imagined justice might feel. It was something quieter, something softer, something sadder. He had finally become a man whose cruelty no longer served him and whose ego no longer protected him. And yet I felt no triumph, only release. Only the knowledge that our story had finally reached its last necessary conversation. When he finished, he stood up and walked back toward me. For a moment, I wondered if he would demand forgiveness or cling to remorse, but he simply set the empty bowl on the counter and looked at me with eyes that had lost all arrogance. "I do not expect anything from you," he said softly. "I know I lost the right to ask for kindness a long time ago, but I want you to have this." He pulled a folded envelope from his coat. I frowned. "What is that?" "My resignation from your life," he said. "Whatever you choose next will never have to include me." He placed it on the counter and stepped back. Then, with one last nod, he turned and walked out of the church, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. I did not open the envelope. I did not need to. Whatever was inside did not matter as much as the act itself. A relinquishing, a release. A door closing that had always been half open in my nightmares. I stepped outside after a moment. The clouds had begun to part, revealing thin streaks of light that touched the ocean surface like tentative fingers. The air was still cold, but it felt different somehow. Sharper, cleaner. I stood there letting the wind lift my hair, letting the sea crash beneath the cliff, letting the old pain dissolve into the gray horizon. "If you had treated me like family," I whispered more to the wind than to him, "you would still have one." And with those words, soft but true, the final thread between us snapped. I did not go back inside right away. I stood on the steps of the church long after Franklin's car disappeared into the curtain of drifting snow, watching the road until the world blurred into soft gray shapes. The cold bit at my cheeks, but it felt cleaner than the heat of humiliation I had known in that Newport ballroom. I let the wind wash over me, carrying away whatever remnants of bitterness still clung to my ribs. The past no longer had claws in me. Not the Hale House, not the years of exclusion, not the slap that cracked my world open in front of 300 people. All of it felt distant, like a storm long past whose thunder you can still remember, but whose rain no longer touches your skin. I tightened my coat and finally walked back into the warmth of the church basement. The clatter of bowls, the low hum of conversation, the faint smell of stew, they grounded me instantly. These sounds belonged to the life I had built, the one that came from my own hands, not from anyone else's approval. My hands. That thought lingered a moment longer than expected. I carried it with me through the rest of the afternoon as I wiped down tables and loaded trays into the industrial sink. When my shift ended, I stepped into the small storage room at the back of the building and sat on an old wooden stool. A single bare light bulb hummed overhead. I placed my hands in my lap and stared at them palms up. They looked older now, mapped with faint wrinkles, softened by time, but still marked by the years of labor that had shaped me. I traced the calluses along my palms with my thumb. These were the same hands that had carried groceries home in the dead of winter in my 20s when I worked 2 jobs to stay afloat. The same hands that had filled out scholarship applications by lamplight after 10-hour shifts. The same hands that had written checks for utility bills that left barely enough for food. The same hands that had held my mother when she cried after arguments with Franklin she pretended were nothing. The same hands that had clung to the steering wheel of my beat-up car on nights when I drove home exhausted, praying it would make it another mile. The same hands that had wired $1 million to pay for a wedding where no one thought I belonged. And the same hands that had steadied a young server at that wedding moments before my entire world changed. My hands had built a life while everyone else looked at me and saw someone who had been handed nothing. They were not wrong. I had been handed nothing, but I had built everything. Slowly, I lowered my hands and let out a long breath, the kind that comes from deep inside the chest where grief and strength live side by side like siblings. My thoughts drifted to my father. I remembered sitting beside him in the dim living room of our old house while he rubbed his tired fingers along his temple after a long day on the construction site. His hands had always fascinated me, big, rough, and warm. They had held my shoulders when I cried. They had lifted me onto his back when my legs were tired. They had fixed our rusted sink, changed heater coils, patched holes in the roof during storms. Those hands had carried our family long before I ever realized what it meant to sacrifice. He used to say that a person's hands tell the truth about who they are. Then he would take mine in his and whisper, "You got strong hands for a girl. You will build a good life with these someday." At the time, I laughed, thinking he simply meant I was good at carrying firewood. I did not understand what he saw. Not until now. The door to the storage room creaked open slowly. Elliot stood framed in the doorway, bundled in a heavy coat, snowflakes melting in his hair.
"Mom told me you might be here,"
he said softly. I smiled and gestured for him to come in. He sat beside me on another stool, his knees bumping mine like when we were teenagers, and the Hale house felt too small to hide from the world. He looked at my hands. "You are staring at them like they told you a secret." "Maybe they did," I murmured. He studied me for a long moment, his expression a blend of sorrow and admiration.
"I do not think I understood you before all this,"
he said finally.
"I do not think I ever realized how much you carried."
"Most people do not," I said gently. "It is not their job to." He shook his head. "No, Grace. It was my job. I should have seen it. I should have spoken up before everything fell apart. You were a kid," I reminded him. A kid who watched the adults around him shape the world. You learned what you were shown. You believed what you were told, but you changed. That is what matters. He exhaled shakily. "I want to be in your life now, really be in it, not halfway, not in the shadows of my father's expectations. You are my sister." I felt a small sting behind my ribs, a soft one. The kind that comes from being seen in a way you never expected. "You always were," I said. He reached for my hands hesitantly, as if asking permission. When I placed them in his, he held them as though they were fragile artifacts, things of value he had never known how to handle. He lifted them slowly and pressed his lips to each knuckle. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "These hands built my life too," he whispered. I shook my head. "No, you built your own. I just helped keep you steady." He smiled, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "But you should have never had to do that alone." A warmth bloomed inside me, a slow, steady warmth that melted something old and rigid in my chest. Elliot and I stayed in that room for a long time, talking about our childhoods, the things we had misunderstood, the things we wished we had known sooner. He told me he had started therapy to unlearn the ways his father's pride had shaped him. He told me he was trying to rebuild his life from the ground up, not with wealth, not with status, but with integrity, with truth. with the kind of foundation no scandal could shake. I listened, not as someone carrying old wounds, but as someone witnessing the rebirth of a person I cared for deeply. When I finally walked him back to his car, the snow had stopped. The clouds had opened just enough to reveal a thin slice of blue sky. He hugged me tightly before driving away, promising he would return the next weekend. I believed him. That evening back in the cottage, I lit a small fire in the stone hearth. The flames cracked softly, casting warm shadows across the modest living room. I pulled out a box I had kept tucked beneath my bed, a box filled with photographs, overdue birthday cards, small trinkets collected from flea markets, and the last picture I had of my father. I set it on my lap. Looking through those items, I felt the full arc of my life press gently against me. From the small coal-stained house of my early years, to the cold marble floors of the Hale mansion, to the ballroom where everything shattered, to this quiet cottage where everything was slowly being rebuilt. A different kind of rebuilding. A life not defined by approval or absence or apology. A life defined by choice. My choice. As the fire warmed my knees, I held the photograph of my father and traced the outline of his hand resting on my shoulder. I wondered what he would think of the woman I had become, the woman who stood up after being struck, the woman who refused to carry someone else's shame, the woman who walked away from wealth built on cruelty, the woman whose hands had worked without recognition, without reward, without rest. I imagined him smiling that soft, tired smile of his, saying the thing he always said when he saw me working hard beyond my years. "You keep going, sweetheart. You keep building." I ran my thumb across the faded image. "Daddy," I whispered, "I built a life, not the kind they wanted me to build, but the kind you would be proud of, and that is enough." The flames crackled again, brightening for a moment, as if in acknowledgement. I leaned back against the sofa, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The world outside the windows was covered in a delicate layer of snow, untouched and shimmering beneath the soft glow of the street lamps. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt a deep sense of peace, not the fragile peace that comes from avoidance or compliance. A real peace. A peace earned by surviving, enduring, and choosing yourself at the end of it all. Before I went to bed, I stepped out onto the porch one last time. The cold night air brushed my face, but it felt gentle now, not sharp, not punishing. I lifted my hands and looked at them in the moonlight. They were not perfect hands, not young hands, not delicate hands, but they were strong, steady, capable. They had carried me through loneliness, through labor, through grief, through humiliation, through anger, through every storm I had ever faced. They had built my life piece by piece. And standing under the quiet blue glow of the Maine sky, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. These hands were enough. These hands had always been enough. When a story ends, the world becomes quiet in a way you do not expect. Not empty, just quiet like the hush that settles over a house after a long storm finally passes. And if you are still here reading these last words with me, then maybe something in Grace's journey struck a chord somewhere deep inside you. Maybe it reminded you of someone you love. Maybe it reminded you of someone you lost. Or maybe it reminded you of yourself. If you have ever been the one who carried the weight while others took the credit, if you have ever been the quiet one in the room full of loud voices that never listened, if you have ever worked until your bones ached, your hands cracked, and still felt invisible, if you have ever been overlooked by the very people you sacrificed the most for, then I want to tell you something now that Grace never heard when she needed it most. You mattered. Your work mattered. Your love mattered. Your presence, steady, consistent, uncelebrated, held more of the world together than anyone ever realized. People do not always see the ones who do the quiet labor that keeps life standing. They overlook the hands that cook meals no one thanks you for, the hands that clean up messes others pretend they did not make, the hands that sign checks that wipe tears that hold families together even when no one asks how you are holding up. People forget. They forget the sacrifices. They forget the late nights. They forget the compromises you made so they could be comfortable. They forget because it is easy. But here is the truth. One day, maybe sooner, maybe later, the truth rises. The quiet strength reveals itself. The love you gave shows its impact. And sometimes the world finally sees what should have been seen all along. So as you reach the end of this story, I want to ask you to do something not for me, but for yourself. Close your eyes for a moment and think of the person whose sacrifices built you. Maybe it was your mother. Maybe it was your father. Maybe a grandmother, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend. Maybe it was someone who raised you not with money, but with patience, with calloused hands, with tired eyes, with small daily acts of love that shaped your life more than you ever said out loud. Think of them. Picture their hands. Picture the way they held on, even when life tried to make them let go. Now call them. Call the person who loved you quietly but fiercely. Tell them you remember. Tell them they mattered. Tell them their sacrifices did not vanish into the dark unnoticed. And if that person is no longer here, then tell their memory. Say it out loud into an empty room. Love does not fade just because someone is gone. And if you are that person, the one who sacrificed, the one who endured, the one who kept going when no one thanked you, then I want you to hear this clearly. I see you. I honor you. And you should honor yourself too. Before you go, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it. Someone else might be living through the same silence you survived. These stories of quiet strength and complicated families and long roads to healing, they matter more than you think. And if you believe they matter, if you believe voices like Grace's deserve to be heard, then I hope you subscribe. Because I believe in telling the stories that remind us of who we are, who we have been, and who we can still become. And I believe your story, yes, yours is part of that.